Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Beth. I am our Director of Product Marketing here at Achievers, and I'm going to be introducing Josh Bersin. But instead of doing a traditional biography, which none of us really want to hear about because they're all the same, well, not Josh's, he's pretty esteemed, I wanted to do the 10 things that you might not know about Josh. And I'm not going to tell you my source. So the first one is that Josh loves to cycle. He's an outdoor cyclist. Bersin by Deloitte, it was called just Bersin and Associates before the Deloitte acquisition, was and is still one of the top HCM analyst firms. If you haven't had a chance to read their research, it's absolutely phenomenal, and I encourage you to do so. His favorite food is meatloaf. Josh was born in Boston. He went to Cornell. He's actually an engineer by trade. That's what he went to school for, which always blows my mind just because of his HR knowledge. He really enjoys Woody Allen movies. He owns over 30 polo t-shirts. And last but not least, Josh has been one of my mentors for the last 5 years, and I'm just so thrilled to have him here at ACE to speak to all of us. This is his second ACE out of the 5 that we've had. So without further ado, please come up and teach us something about being an irresistible organization.
Oh, thank you. That was such a nice, that was really sweet. I think I know where you got that information. Well, you know, there's seats up here. You guys don't have to stand. If you want to sit down, there's plenty of room. It's a little bit intimidating for me to talk about employee engagement with all of you that are out there implementing, dealing with it, measuring it, fixing it, solving it today. There's lots of seats up here, and there's also a flyer for those of you who want to get some of the material. I am an engineer, and so what I do for a living, and I've done for about 15 years, is study HR and people and management and technology and learning from the perspective of what we call what works. So lots and lots of data and lots of information, and then we try to make sense of it all. And what I'm going to share with you this afternoon is information that was gathered through quite a bit of research and lots of studies that summarizes why we have an engagement crisis right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about why the engagement industry is not keeping up. And I don't mean Achievers, but I mean the general engagement industry, which is typically the annual engagement survey, is being really left behind in a lot of organizations. And then what we have found are really the 5 keys to engaging organizations and people over the next probably decade. And there's a lot of research coming out on this. We're going to be writing a very detailed research report that will come out in a couple of weeks. And I'm working on a book on the same topic that'll be out sometime next year. So I'll cover as much of that as I can, and then I'd love to get your questions. So the whole concept is, can we build an organization that is as irresistible as cupcakes? In other words, that people just love to be there. And you know, for me personally, one of the things that Sarah Beth didn't catch was that I love pistachios. So in my life, when I get home at night, and my wife and my family know this, if there's a bag of pistachios there, then I'm happy. And everybody has their own unique thing that they want out of work and out of their career based on where they are in their career and who they are. And so the difficult thing about engagement is, how do we take our organization's goals in one circle and then all the individual goals of all the people that are working for us and figure out how to match those together. And it's a very, very complex problem. And I think over the next couple of years, we're going to redefine it. And I'm trying to figure out what the right word is for it, because I don't think it's engagement anymore. It's something different. And I'm working on that. And when I come up with it, I'll let you know what that word is. But I think it's more profound. Now, let me take a step back and talk a little bit about what's going on in the global economy. We just came out of a recession, if you don't remember. It seems like it was not that. It seems like it's all over, but it really wasn't very long ago. And what we found in the research, as I'll show you in a couple of minutes, is that the contract relationship between employees and employers changed. And Reid Hoffman wrote about that in his book, The Alliance, that just came out, and our research has shown the same thing. And so what employers need to do to engage people going forward is not exactly the same as it was in 2006, 2007, 2008 before the recession hit. And I think that's one of the reasons that this is such an interesting topic. We know, for example, in the United States that the top 5% of the earnings population in the United States makes about 80% of the wealth in the United States. And that pyramid is getting worse and worse, steeper and steeper and steeper over years. Now, there's lots of reasons for that. One of the reasons for that is that technology and very specialized skills now drive your ability to compete in the workplace. If you have a job, if you get out of college in computer science right now, you can, especially if you go to some place like Stanford or MIT, you can walk into a job of $100,000 to $120,000 a year quite easily in the Bay Area, and probably even higher in some places. But if you studied journalism, or if you studied history, or you don't know technology, or you haven't been able to keep up on certain skills, you're probably seeing your earnings potential drop. And I was just reading some research this morning. I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning. For some reason. I was just reading some research this morning from some professors at Oxford, and I'd be happy to share it with anybody who's interested, who studied all the 8,000 jobs in the occupational index in the United States. There's an occupational index of every single job in the United States. They looked at all the economic and social factors that are happening, and they concluded that 47% of those jobs are likely to go away thanks to technology within the next 10 years. So all those people are going to have to retrain themselves or change to new roles. Jobs like accountants, jobs like lawyers, jobs like customer service agents are getting automated, to say nothing of people, and all the other roles. And so this problem is going to continue. Skills are becoming obsoleted at a faster rate. And people are educating themselves in new ways. Does anybody know what a MOOC is? You heard the term MOOC, Massive Open Online Courseware. I started my career as an industry analyst in e-learning back in 1998 when no one had coined the term e-learning yet. Now, and by the way, we had a proliferation of those companies then. Now we have them again, but now it's tens of millions of people are taking these courses. Now, why are they doing that? Not because they just like education, because they want a better job and a better career, and they want to keep up. I was down at Udacity in the Bay Area 2 weeks ago. They're building an entire business around retraining technical experts who are already experts. So if you're an expert on analytics, you need to retrain yourself on R and some of the new technologies that are happening in the analytics area. These are people that are already well paid and they're already well positioned. So we have a workforce that is under stress. Now, in addition to that, as I'll talk to you about in a couple minutes, we also have a widening variation in financial and economic performance. The best example of that is a quote from Bill Gates, and I'm pretty sure he said this. Around the turn of the century, the difference in performance between a great lathe, you know what a lathe is? Did anybody take wood shop? And I actually took wood shop in high school. I don't think anybody does that anymore. Anyway, it's the thing that spins around and you make wood objects out of it. The performance of a great lathe operator was about 8 to 10 times the performance of an average or poor lathe operator. Today, the performance of a great software engineer can be 10,000 times the performance of an average software engineer. So if that person who's 10,000 times more productive is not getting what he or she wants out of your organization, financially or otherwise, and they leave, you have just lost a significant part of your competitive advantage. And I remember Bill Gates saying many times in his early days when he was at Microsoft that there were basically there were 5 or 10 people at Microsoft, and if they left, we wouldn't have had a company. And so these are some of the economic things that are affecting how we manage the workforce and keep people engaged. Now, we did, now I've been part of Deloitte for almost 15, 18 months. We do this annual massive survey of organizations and their talent issues. The one that we just completed last year, we're just about to do this year's again, had some really interesting findings. And this really woke me up. The number one challenge around the world is lack of leadership. This is always number one. It will always be your number one challenge in HR because you're always building new leaders. You're always promoting people into leadership roles. And the way I like to think of it, when you move from a job as an individual contributor to a supervisor, or manager, or leader, you have not changed jobs, you have changed careers. You're now in a career where your success is based on the success of others. And most people get very little training and coaching and development during that transition, causing engagement problems in their teams. And so investment in leadership is a critical part of the solution. The number 2 issue, find my button here, amongst these 2,000 global organizations was engagement and retention. 82% of the these are CEOs and CHROs. 82% of the companies that took this survey cited this as an urgent or critical problem. Now, in the last 12 months, as my daughter will remember, I've been on the road. I probably visited 50 companies, and I showed them this information, and every one of them skipped over the first one and said, yeah, we're working on that, but what do we do about number 2? And it's not only across the board, it's how come we have a plant in this city that has really high turnover and a plant in this city that doesn't have high turnover? What is causing the variation? Why do we have these disparities in engagement and retention around the world? So I'll talk about that in a minute. The number 3 thing we found is something that I think probably will ring true to all of us, is what we call the overwhelmed employee. And I'm going to give you some information on that in a minute. It turns out that about 70%, 75% of the organizations cited said, we have given our people too much technology, too much information, too many emails, too many conference calls, too many meetings, too many whatever, and they are just overstimulated, and they can't deal with it all. Now, that's not just a technology problem that can be solved by platforms like Achievers. That's also a management problem, it's a job design problem, it's an organizational design problem, it's a leadership problem. But that is a big one too. And I think you'll find that some of these irresistible organizations are doing some really interesting things to make work easier and a little bit simpler. And I think simplicity might be the big theme over the next couple of years for HR, is how can we make the world simpler? And then the 4th one, the one that always strikes me, is the skills of HR. And I won't spend a lot of time on this today, but this is something I've spent a lot of time on the last 8 or 9 years. We in the HR profession, and I think I'm one of you, even though I don't do HR, are having a really hard time keeping up. Technologies, practices, workforce changings, cultural changes, demographic changes, globalization, mergers and acquisitions, you name it, all the stuff that goes on in every single industry, it all hits HR. And we're trying to do our jobs, just keep the place running and keep people out of trouble. So this whole issue of engagement, which always sounded like it was kind of simple, if you bought an engagement survey, has now become very complex. And only the sad thing about this, only 8% of the organizations we surveyed have any form of professional development for their HR organizations. So the only message I make to you there is take a little time and come to conferences like this, read, and make sure you're educating yourself on the craft of HR, because the craft of HR is more important than ever. Okay, now engagement. Lots of data on this all over the place. I'll quote the Gallup statistics. It's kind of scary. Only 13% of global organizations are fully engaged. 26% are actively disengaged. That means 1 in 4 employees are going home at night and complaining about your place to somebody. Maybe it's their spouse, maybe it's their friends. I'm going to the Glassdoor Employment Summit on Friday in San Francisco. They gave me access to their entire database. I did a bunch of analysis of it. Scary thing I found, now, Glassdoor may or may not be representative data. It's a little hard to tell, but only 54% of the people in the Glassdoor database recommend their employer to their peers. So about half the people in the Glassdoor database would not recommend that people work for their employers. So those of you in the room, you're probably in the top 10% of the most engaged organizations. But in general, when I go around the world, it is really a problem. One of the problems also in engagement that I think we labor under is this old concept that people leave managers and they don't leave organizations. How many of you have heard that? Right? I don't know where that came from. Actually, the data shows that's not necessarily true. They do leave bad managers. If you're a bad manager, or if you're just abusive, or not fair to people, you will piss people off and they might leave. But they also leave because the organization has problems. And in fact, the new data I've gotten from 2 sources shows that the impact of organizational and environmental issues is actually greater than the impact of your direct manager. One of the reasons for that, I believe, is that managers have such broad spans of control now. We spend a little bit less time with our managers than we used to, and we work in cross-functional teams. When I started in the working world back in the late 70s, I had a very small team. I had a manager sitting right down the hall from me. I talked to him all the time. We don't really work like that anymore. So this engagement problem is a holistic, really systemic issue in organizations. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about today, is just how to think about it as a holistic problem. Okay. Now, you can't talk about engagement without talking about young people and millennials. I'm a data person. I read a lot. I look at a lot of data. I got kind of tired of reading about millennials, but I actually have 2 millennials in my family, and now I get it. There is a different work ethic and work ethos among young people. And if your organization is not filled with young people, you may not know that you're not responding well to that. For example, this research comes from a massive study that Deloitte did. It's free. It's available on the Deloitte website. I encourage you to read it. It's actually quite interesting. And some of the things they found, and this is about, 7,000 or 8,000 young people, working professionals. 70% of these millennials want to start their own companies. Now, why do they want to start their own companies? We've obviously glorified entrepreneurship. Starting a company is not actually very easy. The reason is they want more creative opportunities at work. They want to be able to impact the environment around them. They grew up in a world of Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and whatever it was, and they were always able to manipulate and control their environment, and they got lots of feedback, and they expect that at work. They expect to be promoted roughly every year or 2 into a new position, not necessarily upward, but to move, rotational positions. At Deloitte is a very young company. I'm actually one of the older people in Deloitte. Kind of funny. And everybody moves around all the time. I mean, people are constantly changing jobs, and they love it there. Young people love it there. It's stimulating, exciting. There's lots of challenge, lots of opportunity. And another thing that the research says is that most millennials expect their employer to do more than make money. They expect their employer to do good, and they actually believe that business's role is to help society. God knows, when I graduated from college in the 1970s, nobody ever talked about that. But this is the mindset of people today, and I think one of the reasons this mindset is particularly acute right now is because we just came out of a very bad recession and a lot of ethical lapses that were right in the public eye that a lot of young people saw. And so this issue of mission and purpose and values and culture are really big engagement factors for organizations. Okay. One of the ways to think about this issue of the millennial values is the word soul. I was reading the Everything store about Jeff Bezos, not by Jeff Bezos because it's not actually that complimentary, about Amazon. And if you look at the history of Amazon, and if you're a business sort of person, you really ought to read this book. And one of the things that worried him the most as Amazon was growing is that the company was going to lose its soul, and that people wouldn't like Amazon, and they just wouldn't think it was a good company. And if they didn't think it was a good company, they wouldn't buy from them. And he realized that the way people were being managed and the way the brand was leaking into the market was impacting the soul of the organization. And that's really what it comes down to. If you look at these wonderful companies like Southwest Airlines or Nordstrom's or some of the companies that have been highlighted at this conference, they have a soul. They have meaning. They have value. And when you go to work every day and you work 50, 60, 70 hours, whatever it is, you want to be part of something bigger than yourself. And that is not in the HR book. I don't think you're going to find that in the SHRM PHR certification program. But that is one of the issues we find. And I have the opportunity to sometimes palpably feel the soul of an organization when I go visit them. I'll give you a funny example. I won't mention the name of this company. I went to visit a pharmaceutical company earlier this year. I went to New Jersey. It was raining and cold and snowy. We tromped through this building. We went into the corporate education center. We went to this room for a big presentation. I asked the woman who had hosted us if I could get a cup of coffee, and she said, we don't have any coffee in this building. You have to get in the car and drive across the street and go buy it at the place across the street. And I thought, this is an education center. It sounds a little odd. I said, all right, I'll do without the coffee today. A bunch of people filed into the room, mostly people, middle-aged people. They brought their computers, but there were no plugs in the room. There were no wires. There was no place to plug anything in. It was an old room. I looked around the room. This room didn't have a single electrical outlet in it anywhere. So anyway, we get into the meeting. So I got a few little first impressions, of the organization. We go into the meeting. We have you probably have 40 or 50 HR people. We're talking about all these problems. Somebody says, we have a lot of problems with recruitment. We have a lot of problems with retention. And what should we be doing? And I showed them some of these models, and I gave them some thinking about this, this holistic issue. And I said to them, you guys don't really know what the culture's like here because you're living in it. But this is not what people look for when they come to go to work. And this is a very successful, financially successful company, but they're an old company. And sometimes old companies have established practices that they don't even realize are no longer attractive anymore. And so this issue of soul can manifest itself as many ways. One of the other things that happened in that meeting I thought was really interesting, the woman who runs the diversity program asked a question later, and she said, is there a relationship between diversity and engagement and retention? Because they were completely different groups. One person was doing statistics and programs on diversity. The other one was doing an engagement survey. And I said, absolutely. I mean, one of the most important things that makes people comfortable at work is knowing that their voice is considered and they actually will have a role in the organization. That's an inclusion issue. That's not just a communications issue. So those people weren't even talking to each other. So that's one of my messages this afternoon is that we sometimes have to look at all the things we do in HR together, and we'll find that actually this problem touches many, many parts of the organization. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on this issue of soul, but I think this is a killer. If you haven't read these books, I think you ought to browse through at least one of them. John Mackey and Raj Sisodia wrote 2 books about conscious capitalism, and their essential message is that a little bit what Razor talked about this morning, is that businesses are not profit-making enterprises. They're really there to take care of stakeholders, customers, employees, business partners, channel partners, and stakeholders. And profits are the outcome of being a responsible business. They studied, just like the Great Place to Work people studied the financial performance of the Fortune 100, these guys studied what are called firms of endearment, the companies that define their mission around values and their customer, not around financial returns. Those companies outperformed the S&P 500 by 8 times, not just 1.5 times, 8 times. They were 8 times more profitable over the last 15 years, 4 times more profitable than the good to great companies written about by Jim Collins, which was really the other big business research that was done. So this is a very profound issue that affects financial performance. There's a wonderful piece of research that Deloitte does every year on the culture of purpose, and lots of statistics in there, but companies that define themselves with a meaningful purpose to employees and stakeholders and customers are something like 35% higher retention, 40 or 50% more innovative. They're market leaders. All these business measures come out of this. So this soul thing isn't just something to do to be nice. This is actually good business strategy. Now, the issue of the overwhelmed employee. How many of you feel like this? You guys are awful quiet, but usually when we get into this, everybody looks at their phone. Let me just give you a couple statistics on how bad this is. And I've been picking up all the data on this one too. So Kleiner Perkins does this internet trends study every year. It's 100 pages of information on what's going on the internet. They concluded from their research that the average cell phone user looks at their cell phone 150 times a day. And I don't know how many meetings I've been in, and I hate this about Deloitte, everybody comes into the meeting and they open their laptop and they take out their phone and they just start doing their work in the middle of the meeting. And I wasn't raised that way, and it's very, very difficult to operate like that. But that's the life we lead. And if you look at Twitter, by the way, Twitter, if you remember, Twitter only went public like in the last year. Twitter is, and Twitter's explosive growth, and Twitter's just to me an amazing phenomenon, is an indication that real-time, continuous engagement with our technology is addictive. And we have all become addicted. I mean, I don't know what percentage of people leave their phones on at night. I mean, very high percentage of millennials sleep with their phone right next to their bed, waiting to get a message in the middle of the night. I mean, this is what we're dealing with. I'm not going to make a value judgment on it. It simply is. A lot of psychologists have done research and proven that it is addictive. One of the psychologists I read studied TV. He found that the average TV show changes scenes 40% faster now than it did 3.5 years ago. So this need to be constantly stimulating is starting to proliferate into other parts of our lives. The advertisers are picking it up, and we have to do something about it at work because it's stressing people out. Now, one of the things that's happening, if you kind of follow what's going on in the industry, and I see this all the time, is there's a whole sub-industry out here, and achievers could buy one of these companies that are doing mindfulness classes, they're writing books, they're producing training. I talked to a vendor the other day that sells a software tool that sits on your computer, and every 60 minutes it plays a funny video to get you to relax, and it studies which videos you like. So if you like cats, you see jumping cats. If you like Louis C.K., you see him. And I don't think that's such a bad idea. We got to get up and get away from this technology every now and then, but it is absolutely hurting us. And this is an engagement issue. It burns people out, and it makes it more difficult for them to have the kind of relationships at work that they really want to have. And most of us are not very good at dealing with it. I was one of the reviewers of Arianna Huffington's book, which is an absolutely wonderful book. It's a really good personal book about how to manage your life. And she tells her story, and she tells a lot of stories about her business. And she really makes the case that we all have to really retrain ourselves how to live in this technology environment. They have nap rooms at the Huffington Post. In fact, she started a new website called, I think it's called The Third Metric. It's their website dedicated to employee wellness. It's the fastest growing web property they have. It's growing faster than the Huffington Post itself. So this is a thread that's getting louder and louder and louder by the minute. Now, I happen to live in California, so maybe I hear it a little bit more than everybody else, but I think it's really an important issue. Okay, so what do we do about all this? I am going to spend a couple minutes trying to give you a little bit of a prescriptive solution, and then I'd love to answer some questions. So after about 2 years of research, talking to 50, 60 companies, reading a lot of books, looking at a lot of data, looking at all the vendors, I really boiled it down to 5 things. Number 1, work itself has to be meaningful. At Edward Jones, which is one of the best managed companies I've ever met, they should be an Achievers client. Hopefully you can get them one of these days. You write your own job description, and you decide your performance metrics. And they are a very successful company. And I'll talk about that. Number 2, management, hands-on management. Management plays an enormously important role, as I showed you earlier, and I'll give you some tips on that. Number 3, the work environment. The work environment does not just mean the office or the way the desks and the cubes are configured. It's a little more than that. I mean, these companies like Google and Facebook and most of the tech companies and even Achievers that have these wonderful offices that are out open and they have lots of things to do there, they're not just trying to attract young people. They're trying to make an environment that makes it easier to work. If you think about the stress that I mentioned to you earlier, the environment has a lot of impact on your level of stress and your level of productivity during the day. Number 4 is growth. The number 1 reason people leave companies is they feel they could not get ahead. They couldn't get the next job. That's a difficult problem to solve in a big organization. We've done tons of research on this. I'll give you a couple thoughts on that. And the last is what I call trust in leadership. And I'll talk about that in a minute as well. So let's just run through these one at a time. Meaningful work. Well, the first part of meaningful work is giving people work where they have some sense of autonomy and freedom to contribute. Now, there's some really interesting research that was done by an MIT professor. Her book, I think, is called The Good Job Strategy. I think that's the name of it. And she looked at a variety of retailers, and she found that the retailers that were the most profitable were the ones that spent the most on payroll per square foot, the highest, not the lowest. Because the natural tendency in retail is to try to reduce cost per square foot. Because what those people were doing, and Costco was one of the examples, what those organizations were doing is they were training people to handle multiple jobs. So if something in the store was broken or misconfigured or in the wrong place, somebody could go fix it and they didn't have to find the person that knew how to do it. They had extra people in the store so that if somebody got sick or somebody came in late or if they had a child problem at home, somebody could cover for them. And they had more time to talk to customers and figure out how to rearrange the store and make it better. And those companies had significant higher profitability, counter to the normal idea. So the simple message here is, do the people in the organization you support, or whatever the role is, have the ability to influence the work in the way they want to influence it to improve it? I mean, how many times have you called a customer service agent, perhaps in an airline, and asked them to solve something, and they can't do anything? They just were not given the power. It's no fun for you, and it's no fun for them, and it's not good business for the company. So this is hard work. It's hard to design jobs that give people autonomy, which leads to number 2. You have to select the right people. Of all the research we've ever done, to me, maybe the most profound and interesting research I've ever involved in is this research we did, which we call the science of fit. And what we found, and most of you who've been in recruiting know this, is that there's a whole bunch of very subtle things that impact whether an employee is going to work out in your organization. Most people think the way you hire somebody is you look for somebody who went to a great school, has great grades, and was successful at this job before. And if they hit their numbers before, or they were successful in the same role in another company, we want them. Well, it turns out that's not necessarily true. Cultural factors are sometimes much more important, and a lot of times there's issues in the actual job that you don't understand. And let me give you 1 or 2 quick examples. Bon-Ton Stores, which is a successful retailer, general department store, did an analysis of their cosmetics sales. Cosmetics is one of the most profitable areas in a department store. The rule of thumb in the cosmetics industry is the best cosmetics salespeople are very pretty, right? Because you would want to buy cosmetics from somebody who is very attractive and really knew how to put on makeup. So the cosmetic industry, which hires most of these salespeople, has various ways of hiring people based on how attractive they are and how well they know how to use makeup. So Bon-Ton did an analysis, and they studied the performance of their salespeople, and they did a psychological testing and sort of a psychographic analysis of their employees, and they looked at the characteristics of the top 10% versus the average. And they found that they were not necessarily any different in their appearance, but actually there was something else. They had a very high level of cognitive ability. They were very fast thinkers, which was not at all used in their pre-hire assessment or any of their screening criteria. And they looked at that and they said, now why is that? Well, it turns out in cosmetics, you're standing behind a counter, somebody walks up to you, they stand 2 feet away from you, they immediately say, what would you recommend for me? And you have 500 products to pick from, and you have to very quickly assess this person, get a sense of what's going to look good on them, pick the right product, find it, and get it in front of them fast enough so that you can make a sale. That is a very cognitive processing problem. And they found that the people that had higher IQs, or actually higher cognitive processing skills, were much better fits for that job. Okay? That's an example. Second quick example, I don't know how much time we have, I don't want to waste too much of our time. This one is also kind of funny. AMC Theaters, everybody knows that the theater business makes money on popcorn. They don't make money on the tickets. The tickets roughly cover the cost of the movie, but really if you don't go in there and buy popcorn and soda, you're kind of breaking even, or you might even be losing money for them. So they want you to come in and really have a good time and stand in line and buy a lot of food. And they found the guy who was the head of HR for AMC did an analysis of his theaters, and he found out that there were some theaters that were wildly profitable and others that were not. And so he did a similar kind of analysis, and he looked at employee engagement, and the first thing he found was, wow, we have much higher employee engagement in those stores. So maybe employee engagement is the solution. So we looked at the stores that had high levels of employee engagement. They had high levels of customer service. He says, all right, we're going to do a massive training program on what it means to give customer service and how you do great customer service. 9 months later, they had rolled that out. They had spent all this money. They did a bunch of e-learning. They did a bunch of classroom training. No change in the profitability amongst those stores. So he said to me, he says, I don't know how many millions of dollars we spent on that. He says, one day I was in the shower and it just hit me. I need to hire happy people. I need to hire people that are good-natured and happy and put them in the theaters, and they're going to create a good environment for the theater goers, and then they're going to have more fun, and then they're going to buy more popcorn, and we're going to be more profitable. And he looked at their screening criteria for hiring people. It was grades, it was experience, it was leadership in school. It had nothing to do with, were you in the Glee Club? Were you an artist? I mean, nothing to do with sort of your happiness quotient. I don't really know how you measure that. But, and he said, and we went back and we changed our hiring criteria, and we saw the profitability, the whole business go up by 1 or 2%, which is a huge number. So this is a big issue, getting the right person in the right job and designing the job. By the way, I'm not sure that's always HR's job, too. You need to sometimes insert yourself into management and look at what's going on in these organizations and help them deal with this. The third is small teams. I'll only make a small comment on this. When I worked for IBM in the 1980s, one of the famous books was this book called The Mythical Man Month by Fred Brooks. Back then, when they used to develop software in giant buildings, they found at IBM, and IBM was a big software company, that the more engineers they put on the project, the slower it went. Until pretty soon, they got no software out of them at all. And what happened as a result of that? The agile software movement. Now we have small teams, 5, 6 people. We have stand-up meetings every day. We have scrums. We have all these tools that have been developed to keep the teams small. I mean, Jeff Bezos has this quote that I love. He says, if I walk into a staff meeting and there's more than 2 pizzas in the meeting, I know the team is too big. I need to cut the team in half. And so people relate to 3 to 4 to 5 people. They get to know each other. They can work together. They can share work. They can collaborate. You get 7, 8, 9, 10 people. Have you ever noticed that at a restaurant, most of the tables only have 4 chairs? I mean, there's good reason for that. It's just the way we operate as human beings. And the fourth is time, giving people time. My only comment on this one is, I think the Google 20% time, or somebody in one of the other sessions mentioned 10% time. I think it was at Visa. I don't think those are just innovation programs. I think those are just programs to let people take a little bit of time and just think about their job and do things to make the place better. We all have things we want to do to improve our organization. But if we have no time because we're too busy getting our own work done, we're not going to be able to fulfill our mission of creating good work. Okay, number 2, management. A couple things on this. Clear goal setting. New managers don't often know how to do this. We have research that shows that the more frequently you revisit goals, the better. The turnover rate and the performance impact of goal setting is greater when you talk about goals regularly, even weekly. Those weekly one-on-ones that a lot of managers do, those are very, very healthy things to do. There's software tools that now help you do that. I am not crazy about all the software that was developed that did top-down goal management over the years. I don't want to get in any trouble because I work with a lot of these companies. But that stuff never really worked very well. But what does work is constantly discussing goals and making them transparent. If I'm working on a project that's really important to get done this week, and somebody else knows that I'm working on it, maybe they'll just leave me alone this week, or they'll come in and say, hey, I have something I'm doing that I think would really help you finish that. These are simple things that really make a difference in somebody's life at work. Number 2, coaching, not evaluation. We have written so much research on performance management, it's ridiculous. I want to stop. We've written too much. Managers have to be coaches, not evaluators. The most difficult transition people make when they move into first-line management is they don't know how to be a coach yet unless they had a good coach during their experience. I happen to have a great manager early in my career, but not everybody did. One of the most frequently read blogs I ever put out is one where I talked about my manager early in my career and what it meant to have a great manager who was a coach. And the stories, there's hundreds and hundreds of stories in there from people who did or did not have a good manager who could coach them. We also like to call it strengths-based assessment. Rather than assess people on their weaknesses, you assess people on their strengths, and then they build upon their strengths to overcome their weaknesses. Simple psychology that's been well proven, but very, very hard to do if you haven't done it for a while. Developing managers. Most of the companies I talked to in the last couple of years are shifting their L&D development, their leadership development, down towards first and second line managers. There's been a lot of money spent on senior leaders and executive development and sending people to Harvard and Stanford and all these wonderful programs to build the next CEO, but the first line leaders oftentimes don't get enough. Netflix, I think the best example of that I have is Netflix. If you go through the Netflix Credo, which is online, they have a 6-week training program for new managers at Netflix. They really take it seriously. As the IBM CHRO put it to me when I met with her this year, and IBM's going through a rebuild of their management development as well. It's a matter of re-establishing the nobility of leadership. Being a manager is a very sort of important job, and we need to give people, first of all, we have to make sure the people that get put into leadership want to be in leadership, and they didn't just land there because they were high performers, but make sure they understand that it's really a very important responsibility, and it's much greater than simply telling people what to do. Now, in the area of performance management, I just want to say one thing. If you haven't read up on this, there is a crusade going on around the world to redesign performance appraisals. And the reason for that is the psychology of performance management actually reduces performance. And this is some great research from this wonderful psychologist, David Rock. And he basically found through his research, and he does a lot of corporate consulting, that the 5 things that we operate under 2 modes at work. We have our productive, happy, excited, flow mode when we're really doing good work, and when we have the fear mode. Oh, am I about to get fired? Did I do that wrong? How come nobody came to my meeting that I just scheduled? Did I say the wrong thing? Did I send an email? Oh, I sent an email that it wasn't really what I meant to say. I mean, that makes that when we shift to that kind of thinking, we become unproductive, we make mistakes, we don't collaborate well, we become fearful, we aren't innovative. And so what his research shows is that all sorts of things happen in the workplace that shift us between that highly productive environment and the unproductive environment. The 5 things that he believes do that are loss of status, loss of certainty, loss of autonomy, loss of relatedness, and loss of fairness. All of those things happen during a performance appraisal in most companies. You get judged by one person, you get a rating, which most of the time you're not sure why exactly you got it. You're not sure what your rating is compared to everybody else's. There's all sorts of issues here. So companies now are starting to dismantle this process and make it more agile and make it more coaching and development. And that's another presentation in and of itself. The CHRO of Juniper, Stephen Rice, told me that they used to do performance appraisals 4 times a year, and he looked at sales productivity, and he found that every quarter after the performance appraisal, sales productivity dropped. And he said, my God, our performance management process is reducing our performance. So he read this stuff, and they went back and they redesigned it, and they created a much more coaching and development-oriented process for managing people. Okay, so that's the second one. The third one, work environment. Couple topics on that. Flexibility. Study after study shows that flexibility, that flexibility is a huge issue in retention and in engagement. And for those of us who are professionals, I mean, we're kind of used to being able to work at home, and we can work on airplanes, and we can work at night, and we can work on weekends, and we can work whenever we want, or we can work all the time. But if you're an hourly worker, and you have a son or daughter who you have to pick up at school, or somebody gets sick, this might be the end of your job. You might actually have to quit in order to take care of your family. And that's certainly not a good thing. So if you're in the hospitality industry, the retail industry, customer service, and you have a lot of hourly workers, flexibility is just as important there, maybe even more so than it is in white-collar workers. So there's lots of research on that. Humanistic workplace. I won't spend a lot of time on that. But I think the reality of these open environments, whether they have ping pong tables, free food, people going out at night, yoga classes, there's actually nap rooms in Deloitte. I actually found them. I don't know if you guys know. I actually found a nap room. It's a little hard to find. They're actually just there to make work a little bit easier. They're just made to make work a little more human. Why do people like working at home? Because it's their environment. They can configure it the way they like it. And why shouldn't work be like that too? It doesn't have to be quite so stiff as it was in the 1970s and 1980s. Number 3, recognition. I don't need to convince you guys of this. We did research with Achievers 2 or 3 years ago. It was one of the most fun projects I've ever been involved in. We interviewed and surveyed 400 or 500 companies. We characterized them into maturity model of recognition. I think you can get the research from Achievers directly if you want to read it. But the bottom line, most important thing that I got out of that was that the companies that were in the high recognition culture category had 31% lower voluntary turnover than the others. 31%. That is hundreds of millions of dollars of productivity saved in those organizations. And Razor and I went on the road together and we practiced giving each other hugs because we read the research that when you hug somebody or you thank somebody, you create oxytocin and they actually become happier and they become better employees and they actually are more collaborative and they have more fun. So there's actually chemical stuff that goes on when you thank people. So this isn't just sort of a nice psychological thing to do. You're actually injecting hormones into your people the more recognition that takes place. And then to inclusion. I think there's, we've been doing research on this the last year or two. It's kind of amazing to me, in the diverse world that we live, and I live in a diverse area, how difficult it is to do this. We just did some research that showed that 72% of the organizations we studied believe they have a highly diverse environment, but when we asked them about their practices, only 11% actually did have a highly inclusive environment. Deloitte did research on this in Australia and found that highly inclusive work teams are 80% more productive than non-inclusive work teams. And I'm not talking about just sort of mixing up nationalities and genders and race and religion. I'm talking about inclusion being listening to people who have new ideas and allowing everybody to speak in a meeting, being respectful of other people who might have a slightly different way of seeing the problem. Those are difficult things to do. We all have a lot of unconscious bias, but that affects engagement and your work environment dramatically. Growth opportunities, training, support, and the most important is what I would call a learning culture. I won't talk about the other ones too much, but let me just tell you 1 minute about learning culture. We've studied training more than anybody else in this industry. We have studied training since I started this business in 2001. We've done our high impact learning organization study at least 4 times. We've looked at the impact of technology. We've looked at the impact of e-learning, the impact of how it's structured, of how much money you spent, all this stuff. The biggest impact you have on our organizational learning is culture. Do managers encourage people to learn? Do they give them time to learn? Is learning valued in the organization? Are there embedded opportunities to learn at the end of projects? Cultural aspects, like in the military. The military is really into learning. One of the guys I know years ago who was a general in the military, he said, in the military we only do 2 things. We fight and we train. And if we're not fighting, we're training. So we're always training. And he said, and we train all the time, no matter what happens. We train at the beginning of an event. We train at the end of the event. We do after-action training. We're always talking about what we learned. We take time for it. He said, most corporations don't have time for any of that. They might send you a course catalog or let you log into an LMS and you go take a course if you have time, if your manager lets you have time. So that's really an important factor. And creating a pattern and a system for mobility, which Reid Hoffman calls tours of duty. So that when I get tired of my job, maybe I'm really good at it, I can do something else, and maybe I'm not ready to be promoted, maybe I don't want to be promoted, I just want to do something else, and that I'm going to move to a new role where I actually may not be very productive for a while, but the organization says, that's great, we'll let you learn something new, we might take a hit in productivity over there for a little while, but it's in the organization's interest and your interest, and that creates engagement. Okay, last one, and then I'll take a little bit of time for questions. Trust in leadership. Many studies have shown, the Glassdoor data that I just went through shows it as well, that the most highly correlated factor in a recommendation of an employer to a peer is whether you like and trust leadership. And I don't mean the CEO, I mean leadership in general. So everybody gets sort of squashed together in this one. And that means delivering on the mission and the purpose. It means continuously investing in people, even during bad times. You know, I've been in this industry for a while. I've been through 2 recessions. I've talked to a lot of companies that have cut HR, cut L&D, cut training. And then they've come back 2 years later and they said, you know, we're trying to build it back up again, but nobody really cares because you actually hurt people a lot when you cut that stuff. And so sometimes you cut a tiny amount of money out of the L&D and budget to save, and then you lose a lot more in engagement and retention. Transparency, being open, being honest, and being an inspirational leader and showing people the future. Those are really the keys. So if you really want to be irresistible, you need to think about all of this stuff together. Now, I wasn't going to try to make this complicated today because this is probably more like a 4-hour discussion than a 1-hour. But really what I wanted to do more than anything else is just sensitize you to the fact that really engagement touches almost everything you do. And in many ways, as Razor said this morning, engagement is all you have. You don't really have a product. You don't really have customer retention. You don't really have financial returns if you don't have engagement. And so this idea that engagement is this one guy in the corner who's a psychologist who's running the engagement survey, that's not the way to think about it. We need to think about it as an integral part of everything that goes on in management and HR. And if you do that, you'll find that you can impact it in many subtle ways and improve the performance of your organization. And if we do that, I think we can make our organizations as irresistible as cupcakes. Thank you. All right, do we have any time? You guys want to take a couple of questions? Anybody have any questions? I know we have a couple minutes. Yeah.
Josh, you had mentioned that you were going to potentially comment on what's happening with engagement surveys and the fact that they aren't keeping up.
Yeah, the question is what's going on with engagement surveys. I'll give you my take on this. I'm writing an article on it. I think the engagement survey industry, by the way, I don't want to insult anybody in here who's in that industry, is dominated by some old thinking that started in the psychological movement of the early 1900s about how to measure psychology at work. And there's nothing wrong with the research. It's great. It's interesting information. But the tools are not getting information fast enough or local enough for people to use. And that's why there's this flurry of new technologies for pulse surveys, rapid engagement surveys. There's at least 5 companies I've talked to that are trying to build the next Glassdoor that are going to give your employees the opportunity to complain online about you because you're not giving them the opportunity to do it yourself. So this is going to explode. Now, I don't think annual engagement surveys are going to disappear. But I think most companies are telling me they're just not getting enough information out of it. It's not rapid enough, and they don't know what to do with the information either. So I think there's going to be a more of a real-time feedback process that's going to have to take place in organizations, and that's what we heard about in the last presentation as well. Anybody else have any? Yeah.
Some companies like Adobe have gotten rid of performance reviews altogether.
Okay, Adobe and getting rid of performance reviews. Adobe did not really get rid of performance reviews. What they did is they forced, by the way, at Adobe and most high-tech companies, many of the managers are engineers who are promoted into management, so they may not be natural communicators, is they have a forced check-in process every 3 months where the employee and the manager sit down and they go through a very prescribed set of questions about what happened, what can I do to help you? What do you need from me? That to force this coaching process to happen regularly. So at the end of the year, there isn't this big explosion, or as one company calls it, the drive-by shooting at the end of the year when you get your performance appraisal. But they're forcing this continuous conversation and feedback to take place through some very agile tools. And then at the end of the year, there's still a review process, but they don't use a number. They use a more qualitative review. Like I think at Juniper, they have basically, you're embodying J values, you're partly embodying J values, you're not embodying J values. And if you get the third one, you probably aren't going to work here. The other two are pretty much similar. So they're trying to do away with this, this number. Now the next question is, how do we pay people and how do we decide how to do compensation? That's always the next question. You still have to do that, so you still have to have talent reviews, and you still have to have collaboration sessions, and you still have to look at comp. But there's many factors in comp that are separate from just performance, and that gives you a chance to look at other factors in comp that are not just performance related. I think Steve is about to shoot me out. Are you up next?
No, I'm not about to shoot you.
All right.
In fact,
anyway,
I'm about to do this. I'm about to come up here and thank you.
All right. Way to get me off the stage. Thank you. Anyway,
no,
thank you very much.
I've had the opportunity to follow Josh and then work with Josh throughout my HR career as well. And I can tell you my opinion of you, Josh, is that I've never met anyone who has a better grasp of what we should all be thinking about and caring about right now. Not yesterday, not 5 years from now, but right now. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
One more round of applause for Josh.
Thank you.